Hello and welcome to a skeleton key to Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment. This is the sort of beginning text of my field of critical social theory. It was written by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno during their exile from the Nazi regime in Germany while they were living as sort of expatriates in California. Next door neighbors, actually, at least Adorno was next door neighbors to Thomas Mann. I think Schoenberg was nearby. Stravinsky, the composer Stravinsky, was nearby. And so there was sort of this group of enlightened intellectuals from Germany, mostly with Jewish background, who were gathered together. And this book was a result of the collaboration between Horkheimer and Adorno. Now, I'm going to be using Adorno's name more often than Horkheimer's. Velmer and other commentators have noted that there's great continuity between this book and Adorno's other work, and less continuity between this book and Horkheimer others' work. We're going to be focusing largely upon, we'll look at other things too, but largely upon Excursus 1, Odysseus, or Myth and Enlightenment is page 35 to 62 in the book, and the records we have available apparently reveal that Adorno was indeed the sort of the primary author of that section, and his notes, his handwritten notes, mark up the original typescript of it. So that's where we're going with this. So again, it's a very hard book to summarize, in part because by intention, it that the logic of sort of negative dialectics is built into this. The kind of logic in Adorno's other work on philosophy of new music, his critique of the culture industry, and so on, are embedded here, and so it's a really important book. It's more accessible in some ways than other texts by these two authors. However, I have found that the book often gets pointed to, and people sort of reduce the book to a few slogans, and often not inaccurate, but that the slogans themselves sort of create a brand image that gets in the way of us actually doing what I would call, negative dialectics or dialectical thinking or critical sociology. So labeling oneself with the brand of Horkheimer and Adorno is one thing, but actually engaging seriously with the logic of and the intellectual project of immanent critique and defetishization and so on that these authors are engaged in seems crucial in our time. So rather than try to summarize the book, I'm going to try to point to a skeleton key to it, and then to work our way through the Odysseus section in some detail. And then at the end of that, I'm hoping that the logic of the book is comprehensible enough that then you can work your way back into it as well. So I'm not trying to substitute for reading Dialectic of Enlightenment. I'm instead trying to help people work through the book instead of work around it. Okay, which I think is really important in our time. Okay, so let's begin then. So why this book and why that excursus? Why focus on Odysseus? It's kind of interesting in this book that's written in the middle of Nazism and emigration and really an unfolding Holocaust. It's so interesting to me that the first actual empirical object that they analyze is a 2,800-year-old epic poem. So it's really interesting to me. Why there? It's something that's very vivid. I understand it. Almost anyone can comprehend what's going on in Homer's poem. And so it seems like a really promising place for us to get a hold of the logic of the Dialectic of Enlightenment, is to focus on the Odyssey. And throughout this, I'm going to be making a claim. My claim is that Adorno and Horkheimer are working here. There's philosophy, yes. There's other things going on, but they're also sociologists. There's a lot of sociology being quoted here, or at least being pointed to in these first couple of chapters. And so as sociologists, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, following, I think, the great philosopher Georg Hegel, all are engaged in a project of placing an individual into the context of an immanent structure. And like the way I often tell my students is that to be a sociologist or sociological theorist is to recognize that the universal of human history or the history of civilization isn't just an aggregation of individuals, but it's rather a structure of particularity, and that different societies have a different structure or particularity, so that the universal of a society is determined by the structure of particularity that composes it. And this structure is immanent. That means that it's in the actual world of society itself. It's not something imposed on it from without or that one can think about as a kind of Platonic form, but rather it's a structure that's inbuilt. It's inner to the world itself. In the same way that the structure of music is built in to the harmonics of physics, quite honestly. It's there and it can't quite be avoided. We can deal with it differently, but the immanent structure is there. So society is an immanent structure. We can't avoid it. It bears down upon us. It weighs us down. It controls us. It indicates us. And so that's what sociologists do. They try to understand the immanent structure that determines the particularity of our time and that relates us to the universal, right? It often happens behind our back or above our heads in an unconscious manner, but it nevertheless is there. So sociologists are often theorizing real things that we all have to cope with at all times, but are nevertheless not easily seen. Emil Durkheim said that what you do as a sociologist is you analyze things he called social tracks, social facts, which are sort of like tracks in the snow left behind by society. We can't see society itself, but we can see the tracks it leaves behind, or the other sort of materialized, objectified leavings. Right? We can see that. So that's what a sociologist does. And so my claim is, whatever else is going on in this book, Adorno and Horkheimer are doing sociology. So maybe the best way to get going in this is to actually skip past the section I want to focus on, which is the section on Odysseus. And I don't want to focus at all on de Sade and Juliet, but there are some things that are sort of summarized right after the section that we're dealing with that seem useful to us. So and maybe I can do this really fast. I'm not sure how to lay it out exactly. I've got multiple little summaries here, but in at the very beginning of the Excursus 2 is a quotation of Kant, right? So this is from Kant's famous essay, What is the Enlightenment? Or What is Enlightenment? Enlightenment is the human being's emerges from incurred minority, right? Minority. Or it's often translated as tutelage. I'm going to use my handwritten notes here. It says inability to make use of one's own understanding without the direction from another. That's what unenlightened thinking is. But having understanding guided by reason means that the mind is capable of combining individual cognitions into a system in accordance with its own inner logic, right? Its own immanent logic. So an enlightened person stops looking to others or to gods or to demons or to devils or to myths to guide their life, but they instead look inwardly and guide their life from reason. So Horkheimer Adorno note that the collective unity of reason is the system itself, and that the hierarchical ordering of concepts is usually involved in reason. There's a kind of an ascending thought ascends to higher genera, higher universals, and descends down to local or lower individual species. There's a connection between the parts. There's a conformity with a single principle. Unity lies in self-consistency. So this is one of the claims that's going to occur over and over again in this book, is this idea that following Kant, enlightenment is self-determination. It's autonomous subjectivity. It's the post-Descartes Cartesian subject of one's own thoughts. I'm not determined by others or by nature. I'm determined by my own thoughts. But that to be a Cartesian subject is to be reasonable, and that there's a system-like quality to reason, a hierarchical ordering to reason. They often use the term categorical reason, that reason tends to categorize things. And if you place the world of objects into categories and systematize it, there's difference in the categories, but there's also unity. There's something like a unity, an identity, so that underneath the categories is identity, right? And that you can find unity by going up in terms of generality, right? And then you find greater diversity moving down. But there's something like unity, logic, cohesion, consistency within a system of reason. So reason is the faculty then of deducing the particular from the general, finding the homogeneity that links the general and the particular together, finding a schema, that kind of thing. So the Enlightenment then assists subjects, individuals or collective subjects, in mastering nature. More on that as we go. So this is part of the dialectic. The Dialectic of Enlightenment dispels fears, devils, angels, myths, places people in control of themselves through reason, but at the same time it gives them power, and a power to master nature and to master each other. It becomes instrumental reason, instrumental power. And that the unity of the system lies in self-preservation. Now, this term comes up everywhere in the first chapter. It definitely comes up in the chapter on Odysseus, and it threw me at first. It didn't seem right. Like, how could the unifying logic of the Enlightenment be self-preservation? But look what they say on page again 65. Immaturity is the inability to survive. And if you're mature, you're able to adapt and to innovate and to be flexible and meet the world anyway in such a way that you're able to survive. So the bourgeois subject, the post-Enlightenment Cartesian subject of thoughts of autonomous subjectivity, has successive forms: the slave owner, the free entrepreneur of the kind of Weberian world of market, early market capitalism, and then the administrator. So there's these three sort of historical epochs pointed to here. And the bourgeoisie can be slave owners or masters. They can free entrepreneurs. And then in our time, a system of total administration where the bourgeoisie takes on the form of the administrator. These are all this logical subject of enlightenment. People who aren't just free from fear and dispelling myths of religion and reason and becoming reasonable, but they're also people who are subjects of these systems of domination, instrumental reason. All right, so the Enlightenment subjects then are in real opposition to each other. So they're not just subjects of nature, but they're subjects competing with each other to master nature and to master each other. There's an interesting section on page 65, 66, 67, where there's a kind of critique of Kant, where Kant would say that, like with the categorical imperative, in which one is attempting to make one's actions a universal rule, where you're trying to find something like mutual regard. I'll just read my own writing here. Kant presumes something like a communitarian world, a kind of pious Lutheranism, in which mutual respect, reciprocal love, respect for each other, that kind of thing, are underneath, are the kind of unifying logic of bourgeois society. So that reason tends to unify, or to sort of not go off the rails into domination, because it's held together or mediated by reciprocal love, that kind of thing. And therefore you don't become barbaristic or nihilistic. That you treat people as ends, not mere means, and that would prevent reason from becoming the kind of thing that Adorno and Horkheimer are pointing to. But if you go to page 65, there's a couple of places here. Yeah. So they're going to argue, look, unfortunately, this doesn't happen, that this utopian world of communicative reason and people taking each other as ends and so on doesn't happen. Instead, reason winds up in the world of self-preservation and material subjugation. The true nature of the schematization, the unifying logic of the Enlightenment, then, the thing that externally coordinates, right? The universal and the particular and the individual, the thing that unifies it, is the unifying logic, also of science, but it's the unifying logic of industrial society. Monopoly capitalism in the form that it was taking in the 1940s. So underneath everything is capitalism, right? So science isn't just about generating knowledge and freedom from fear, but it's also building a system of domination under the logic of capital. And so you can read that there on page 66, 67. Again, more about communitarian Lutheranism. Essentially, it's this kind of logic, this communicative society, as a mediating thing on page 67 that Kant pointed to that didn't actually happen. Look down here. Yeah, the totalitarian order. Yeah. If Kant writes one of these great moral forces, reciprocal love and respect, were to collapse, so if you were to have enlightenment and get rid of that kind of Lutheran notion of mutual love and respect, you get rid of that, then nothingness, nihilism, or immorality, with gaping maw, would drink the whole realm of moral beings like a drop of water. Okay? So this is what Adorno and Horkheimer are pointing to, right? That idea of mutual love mediating or negating or controlling or putting boundary conditions upon instrumental reason, that's gone. So therefore you wind up with a totalitarian logic of domination, and the totalitarian order has put this into effect in utter seriousness, freed from supervision by one's own class, treating other bourgeois subjects as ends. Once that is gone, and that's what the 19th century business person had to do, treat other business people at least as ends, treat the world of the market essentially as people who are moral equals of your own. Once that goes, contrary to the categorical imperative and all the more deeply in accord with pure reason, treat human beings becomes thingified, reified, and so on. So naked violence. The world becomes flooded with naked violence, which is now broken out all over Europe. Economic concentration, and it was okay, that kind of thing. So there it is. So you wind up with totalitarianism and the treatment of other human beings, not as ends, but as pure means, things that are dominated in the same way that science itself dominates nature. Okay? So self-preservation, which seems like a good thing, winds up transformed under the Enlightenment, which has been transformed under capital, right, into this utter system of domination, treating people as ends. And to me, that little section, what I've just talked about here, the idea that underneath the Enlightenment has a dialectic to it. It both disenchants the world and it also dominates the world. And then once you do away with mutual recognition and any kind of sort of pious, Protestant notions that we're all God's children, once that is gone, you wind up with naked violence, naked domination, and so on. And hence Nazism. So treating people as means, not ends, is what you wind up with, right? So you get instrumental reason. It's going to be one of our core terms here. Instrumental reason, right? Purposiveness without purpose, right? Not having a purpose. And then after liberalism ends, after you get rid of sort of, the religiously tinged liberalism of the early capitalist era, the stuff that Weber writes about, once that goes away, you wind up with totalitarianism. So yes, and then there's an interesting section there about the death of gods and myth and the rise of false gods. We're going to be talking a lot about that in a few minutes, so we'll leave that behind. Yeah. So page 68, after liberalism, you wind up totalitarianism. He also calls it here, I really like it, fascistically rationalized forms of power, right? Fascism. And then instrumental reason is at page 69. That's where the quote comes from. Purposiveness without purpose as a sort of definition of instrumental reason. So page 72 to 73, again, is that discussion about enlightenment killing off all the other gods, a kind of brutal logic of colonization. I should point to that here because it's so powerful. Yeah. So under imperialism, so this is interesting. So Adorno and Horkheimer are sharing Arendt's claim that prior to totalitarianism was imperialism, and in many ways what imperialism is the turning of the logic of empire onto the sort of native population itself. And so under imperialism, take away its God from the people, which to subjugate and you will demoralize it. As long as it has no other God than yours, you will always be its master. Granted in return the widest, most criminal license, never punish it except when it turns against you. It's that kind of nihilism there. Talk about Calvinism and the Catholic God here. Okay, hi. Just had a day of technical difficulties here, so I'll try to pick up about where we left off. I'm trying to remember exactly where we were when the recording went to pieces. I think we were looking at the section about page 70, 71, 72 on the sort of the death of the gods at the hands of the bourgeois, the enlightened bourgeois, and how this. So there's this little discussion about imperialism and how you take away people's gods, you basically demoralize them, and then they're easier to rule, and you only give them your own god back, right? So you basically it functions as a kind of enlightenment. They're no longer afraid of their old god, but the god that you give them is one of domination. And like I said, there's like 2 pages or so walking through this argument, a little bit about Hobbes and so on. And then, I think it really reaches its peak here. A little discussion again about the old gods being destroyed on about page 72. And then, so let me see here. So, I actually have a little drawing. So let's read this first and look at the drawing. So from pre-animism to magic, from matriarchal to patriarchal culture, from the polytheism of the slave traders to the Catholic hierarchy, each replaced the older mythologies with new, albeit enlightened ones. So there's this idea of sort of spirit in the Hegelian sense working its way up through progressive stages of enlightenment, where each new god that supersedes the old god or sense of sacred is experienced as an enlightenment, but it's also experienced because it functions for the new ruling class as a mechanism of control and domination, right? So the Great Mother replaced the god of hosts, the totem. The Great Mother was replaced with the god of hosts, the totem with the veneration of the Lamb, Christianity. In the glare of enlightened reason, any devotion which believed itself objective, grounded in the matter at hand, was dispelled as mythological. And so all pre-existing ties were tabooed. The instrument by means of which the bourgeoisie had come to power, the unfettering of forces, universal freedom, self-determination, in short, the Enlightenment, turned against the bourgeoisie as soon as that class, as a system of rule, was forced to suppress those it ruled. And then you wind up in again, all of those sort of bourgeois virtues that, again, Weber wrote about, Ernst Rausch wrote about, Thomas Mann wrote about, in the great novel Buddenbrooks, which traces 4 generations of a bourgeois family, that early embedding of the bourgeois in a sort of a situation of civic virtue and charity, where you see yourself as one with those around you, right? That has now all been proclaimed as lies, leaving nothing behind but sort of pure naked domination. Okay, so that's about where we had ended. And so if I were to try to, again, this is not even a drawing; it's just sort of a rough sketch here. But the Dialectic of Enlightenment in this book, then, is essentially a division between the Enlightenment as the disenchantment of the world, in Weber's terms, right out of chapter 1. The disenchantment of the world. So that comes from Max Weber, the great essay on sciences of vocation, page 155 in the Girth and Mills collection. The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. Precisely the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life, either into the transcendent realm of mystic life or into the brotherliness of direct and personal human relations. It's not accidental that our greatest art is intimate, not monumental, and so on. So the person who can't bear the fate of our times, like a man, should run into the arms of the church, he says, right? And so again, this is science as a vocation. So looking at at essentially the Enlightenment and the effect of the Enlightenment, the rationalization that goes along with the Enlightenment on the structure of modernity. So that's one half essentially of the antinomy or the kind of the dialectical split in the Enlightenment. The disenchantment of the world, so killing off of God, spirits, demons, getting rid of fear and irrational fear, and so on, and then the bright shining light of reason on the world. Okay, so that's over here. So disenchantment, where essentially the old gods, the old demons are revealed as not being real, and it sort of puts you, into humanity to a situation of again of ease. We don't fear the old gods. We can now stand on our hind legs and begin to act, and so that leads to mastery but mastery of nature as well as domination of others. So enlightenment is always both things. It's always the disenchantment and the loss of myth and ritual and gods and sacredness and demons on that side, and at the other side, it's always an enhancement of of instrumental power, of the power of the means to pursue particular ends. And of course, since many of the ends, as Weber wrote about, were ultimately linked to the myths of the time, as those disappear, the ends disappear as well, right? And so both of these sort of splits in enlightenment are relatively uncontrolled, and they move in their own sort of dynamic under their own dynamic. And so you can't really stop enlightenment at the justification of the God that mythically supports one particular order. It's going to keep moving. On the other hand, you can't sort of stop enlightenment at a particular technique or technological structure or technotion. You're not able to do that. It's going to keep moving as well. And so there's going to be this constant revolution of the means of production, all things solid melt into the air, all those kind of Marxist materialist notions about the dynamism of capitalism as it pursues relative surplus value in particular. And on the other hand, you have this never-ending process of disenchantment that isn't going to stop, that's just going to keep right on going. So eventually, as we saw in that quote from Kant that they're using here, that eventually if we lose a brotherly love or we lose the idea of mutual regard and mutual responsibility, we wind up with nihilism, nothingism, and total immorality, and then really nothing can stop the totalization of a system of purposiveness without purpose, instrumental reason that isn't tied to any kind of human end, right? Or ethical end in any kind of normal way. So that's the dialectic. So, again, I get irritated. I see echoes of Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion here, where Hegel, maybe if I just show you even the outline in the table of contents, the 1827 lectures. But where, Hegel, that spirit begins with nature religion or immediate religion, the religion of mana. And then it begins to work its way up from there into the religion of being with itself, Buddhism, Lamaism, Hinduism, transitioning into the religion of light and so on, and then eventually working its way up to what he calls determinate religion, Christianity in essence, right, or the consummate religion. And so you start out here in a dark, unenlightened beginning. Nature religion is what Hegel refers to as the original conditions, sort of the Hobbesian or Rousseauian original conditions of human beings, right? Kind of the world of mana in Durkheimian terms of undifferentiated, raw spiritual force that is widespread within the world. The Garden of Eden sort of world of immediacy, right? You don't need a magician. You don't need anything. The whole world is sacred, including you. And so you're surrounded by immanent sacred forces, that kind of thing. And then eventually, again, you keep working your way up into magic and animism, sorcery, magicians, fetishism, Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism. And throughout, Hegel always argues that the cultus is the real body, the social body of the sacred, and then the imaginary of it, the myth of it is, and the rituals of it are separate, right? That the cultus is the enactors of the ritual in accord with the myth, that kind of thing. And so there's always this kind of, again, this trend, this intangible element to religion. And as it proceeds, it kind of proceeds in a kind of spiral, right? And so each round or turn of the wheel um, is experienced as an enlightenment to those who lost their old gods or old demons, right? And so they were disenchanted, but at the same time, it's also experienced by the on the part of the ruling class as an advance in the technological control and domination and mastery of people, right? And so there's a bit of that built in. It's not complete. It isn't tied into a careful reading of Hegel or anyone else who's sort of studying the natural history, I guess, or the social history of religion, but it's there. And so he's got this kind of account of early mana, then magic and sorcery, then working up to sacrifice, then after that working up to some of the other forms of religions. I've kind of tried to depict that here. And so each one of these, so one of his claims, right? Myth is always enlightenment, and enlightenment is always myth. So myth is enlightenment in the sense that even when you're getting a new myth, say of the Greeks, of the Olympian gods, the Olympian deities, right? That's an enlightenment. It's less what mythical or it's an advance past the chthonic gods or elemental gods that had dominated before, or Judaism is experienced, this monotheistic religion as something that's an enlightenment, right, from what came before. But nevertheless, it's still a reassertion of a new myth, another myth. So it's a myth that's enlightened relative to what came before, but it nevertheless establishes a new sort of mythic structure. But it isn't just a swing of a pendulum back and forth. It has that kind of, the dialectical development of absolute spirit that we recognize from Hegel. It's there. And so he's kind of rehearsing some of that in kind of a rough way, referencing Emile Durkheim, the sociologist Emile Durkheim, and some of the Durkheimians. He references Freud at multiple moments. So it's Weber, of course, and so that's there. But that's so you work your way up. You get to the Greeks, the Jewish religion, medieval or Roman Christianity, the master-slave world. Then you get to again the Enlightenment as such, the bourgeois city-based Enlightenment that generates the Weberian Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. The Reformation is again a close associate with that. The emergence of science is a close associate with that. Some of the work of even the American sociologist Robert Merton on the Reformation and the importance of science. So it's all underneath their argument. And again, where I think this goes then is this idea that from their standpoint, writing in the midst of fascism, of Nazism, of the Holocaust, of World War II, from their standpoint, they weren't seeing the domination and the inhuman unleashing of instrumental reason right down to the destruction of persons, right? They didn't see that as an aberrant externality to the Enlightenment or to Western culture or to capitalism or to science. They saw it as a moment in this dialectical unfolding. And so you can't look outside externally and or find a position from outside of the West from which you can critique this tragedy that was unfolding in the form of fascism. Instead, you had to find the problem inside. So it's an immanent critique of the moments of domination that are built into these moments of enlightenment, of disenchantment. So again, it's this constant thing that at the same time that you are removing the fear of demons and devils, you are at the same time increasing the technology of control and domination, and that's sort of where this ends up. So I think I'm just going to check this, and we'll see how this comes out, and then move on. Okay, so I think what I'd like to do then now is just look very briefly at the first chapter, the concept of enlightenment. Okay, and we're going to set up the Odysseus piece, and of course Odysseus shows up in there about page 25 in the famous incident of the sirens. But what we're doing here is essentially following the logic of the book, which is that enlightenment is always rooted in a kind of, the displacement of an already existing myth, but that it ultimately turns back into myth itself. So enlightenment has a kind of antinomic or uh, a split in its primary effects and in the way that it interacts with the social world. It disenchants the world by killing off the old gods, the demons, and the old rituals, or at least rendering them ineffective, or uh, uh, reducing the power. And at the same time, it enhances the technologies of control, mastery, and domination. So that's the term of instrumental reason. It enhances the means that human beings have, or at least the dominant class has, to achieve ends. Okay? But remember, the ends of the world ultimately come to us from myth itself, right? And from the qualitative distinctions about the world that human beings carry around in their symbolic order, right? So as that gets disrupted or taken away or replaced by a new myth, you essentially get a replacement of the old ends of life, honoring the old gods and demons and so on. That's all been disenchanted, but you get something new that replaces it, that gives a kind of order, a logic to the world, right? That becomes this new unifying logic. And that the means of the world then, right? So you get a new means, you get the destruction of the old, you get rid of the old ends of life, and you get the replacement with some kind of new end. And at the same time, you get an enhancement of the means available to achieve ends. Now, one of the things that they're really good at, Adorno and Horkheimer, is to recognize that myths are always lies. They're always lies. And so, and it's going to have a lying component built into it, so that the real enhancement of the world through the technologies of control often accrues to the elites of the world, not to the masses, right? So there's an ideological component in here and a critique of ideology. But again, all of this is immanent to the world that they're looking at, right? Not out next external to it. So from the very first time that a new sorcerer generated a fetish and began to control a group of people who had previously had their own fetish or their own organization of mana, from the first time that happened, that was enlightenment. That both disenchanted the world and generated a kind of cultural system of domination and control that enhanced the ability to deceive and to maintain the power of the elite. So that's where this goes. So if we were to do it, I could look at either way. Let's just really walk through my notes. It just goes so much faster. So page 1 of the book then is the quote from Weber. So the Enlightenment is the disenchantment of the world. It liberates human beings from fear and installs them as masters over the world, the dead myths of the world. So that's one. Then, and he could have stuck with that because Weber actually makes the next point too. But then he goes into Bacon's account of liberating them and installing them as masters. That you get traditions that go away, beliefs that go away, and that gets replaced by knowledge. You get certainty of the old beliefs that gets displaced by doubt. So you have a world of doubt and knowledge, and a world without tradition, right? Or at least where the old tradition goes away. And that yields instrumental knowledge. Page 2, instrumental knowledge and technology, or capital, right? Explicitly references capital already on page 2. Also on page 2, you get disenchantment always kills gods, and meaning, the ends of life disappear, and then all that is left is means, right? So in our little image that we have here, you get rid of the ends of life, means are all that remain, right? It is purposiveness without purpose, right? So you can see there's kind of nihilism that is always in danger of coming out here. So the disenchantment kills gods, meanings it ends. So enlightenment, science absorbs theology and gods, leaving behind calculability and utility. Really important. Okay, so matrix of themes then that emerges and continues then throughout these early sections of the book, laid out on page 4. So this matrix includes enlightenment as totalitarian. So there's a unity of thought under a system. There's a unifying logic that always comes in. There's discussion of that. And in the end, what happens under enlightenment is that the previous distinctions that used to be made, the qualitative differences, wind up being erased, And instead, the things that had been set apart aren't anymore. Sacredness is disrupted. So you wind up with this fully profane world, and it all winds up homogenized under the unifying logic of the new system. And then there's a search for a common denominator. You reach a kind of level of generality in which you can find the common in the particular. And then that common becomes the mediating denominator, right, that unites across all difference. So the non-identical goes away and all winds up in identity. So there's one universal science according to Bacon, one universal math according to Leibniz. The equation, the mathematical equation, something equaling something else, the equal sign, that reduces everything to number, to calculation, to equation, to quantity, and not quality. And that this logic, which reaches its fullest expression, of course, in the actual Enlightenment, is always there in a kind of earlier form in the great civilizations and the emergence of these gods and religious systems, past the original state in Hegel, right? Okay, so that makes sense. So everything gets reduced to commonality. So bourgeois society then is ruled by equivalence. It makes qualitative dissimilarity, qualitatively dissimilar things comparable by reducing them to an abstract quantity. So this is very much Marx's theory of value, right? The labor theory of value, and it's really the commodity fetish writ large, right? That commodity fetishism is the inability to see essentially the labor process and the real human relations that are necessary for the production of and exchange of commodities. That gets lost, and you only see instead a kind of fetish form of them, and that's what's being recognized here. So everything is tradable for everything else. The value of everything can be expressed in everything else. Money can be the ultimate mediator here, right? So there's a congruence here between thought and the material foundation of capitalism under the Enlightenment. So page 5. So unity remains the watchword. All gods, all qualities must be destroyed, and I really think that's essential. Page 5. All qualities are destroyed, leaving behind quantities that can be equated, right, and exchanged. All right. So hence all gods, all spirits, all magic, all demons, all traditions, all myths fall victim to the Enlightenment. And I can grab this. And here's where Adorno, and I always have trouble with this section. So again, I don't think they do a complete review of either Hegel or that kind of speculative anthropology of the 19th century. They get a few things wrong. It's all incomplete, but there's enough there. And at somewhere on page 5, they reference something like Hesiod's Theogony, the birth of the gods, which is also a cosmogony, cosmogony, the birth of the cosmos. So there's a decline of the chthonic, local magical spirits or demons or titans or giants, right? And a war between them and the priestly kind of universal heavenly gods, right? The Olympian deities. So, the theogony is a narrative of this sort of war of the gods, displacing the old gods with the new, and the new are an enlightened sun god, for heaven's sakes, is at the core of the whole thing. So magic gets replaced by religion, enlightenment relatively, but religion probably grabs hold of people more powerfully, and hence you wind up with an enhancement of control. Sorcery and magicians are replaced by priests and sacrifice. Now here's where it gets kind of interesting. So they go on and they talk about how the new deities of enlightenment, Apollo, the sun god, the god of light, the Persian god of light, and so on. They separate out the logos from creation, the cosmos or creation, and the theos or the gods get separated out from each other, right? And the logos or the logic get separated as well. So anyway, so that's which is an advance, right? An enhancement both of enlightenment and of control of as a technology of social control. Page 6. Again, I don't like this very much, but we'll just leave it. Mimesis, they argue, is the essence of magic. Magicians mimic the appearance of the thing that they want to control, and that has magic effects. Again, technically, it's in Freud, it's in, I think it's in Tyler, it's in Fraser. The idea is that in Totem and Taboo, two forms of magic, sympathetic magic and associative magic, association.
and they're leaving association out. But anyway, it works, okay? So magic operates through the assumption of the appearance of the thing that you want to control. And that means that you can't do a lot of substitution. But in page 7, the world of sacrifice allows substitution and exchange. So what you can do is you can have a ritual where you substitute one sacrificial victim for another, where you kill a goat or your son Isaac, and in exchange for that you get godly benefits, right? And so the benefits and the costs can be substituted, right? The sacrificial victim can be separated out. So sacrifice allows for a substitution. So again, it's an advance in enlightenment, an advance in technologies of control, and the language gets separated from the cosmos, from the things themselves. Again, a more enlightened view, but also a more instrumentally powerful view of control. Page 8. This ultimately sets up universal fungibility, right? The idea that everything, it's a quote from them, right? The identity of everything with everything. Uniformity, conformity everywhere, and then the elimination of all incommensurability. So everything is identical. So you eliminate the non-identical. Everything is about the identical. Only the identical, the things that can be equated in a calculable way, have social value. Okay, and that this is one of the kind of the necessary outcomes of enlightenment. Okay, page 9. Then it gets into this thing where like the cultus or the actual social body of a particular mythic structure. Um, so he talks about the horde, the sort of Darwinian horde that both Freud and Durkheim reference, especially Freud, in like the mass psychology and the analysis of the ego. He writes directly about the the Darwinian horde. So that's a world in which there really isn't any differentiation. There isn't a division of labor. There's not really a stable hierarchy, right? You just have a kind of a horde of people that are bonded together by sort of the direct power of the alpha male. Anyway, the Hitler Youth, he argues, are a kind of a reconstruction of that. Do we need to really go into that? I think what we get at here is this idea that as Enlightenment progresses, efforts to resist Enlightenment often reignite or pour cultural gasoline on old forms that have been superseded, and then they take on a kind of a lie, a deceptive form, and that's often quite regressive. Something they're worried about: regression, cultural regression, psychological regression, social regression, back to the world of raw power. And he thinks that that's sort of what's happening here and again in this world of undifferentiated archaic bonding that we find among the fascist youth of Europe. So Homer's Odyssey. Homer was a slave owner. The Indra, Zeus, gods of the Enlightenment, literally shine light on things. Again, more of that kind of that kind of a primitive and not very sophisticated review of speculative anthropology. But at page 10 and 11, a discussion of the names of the gods for petrified fear. That's kind of interesting. But that there's a discussion of unity under mana. Everything was the same. So in the earliest times, mana was everywhere, and mana didn't differentiate into good and bad. It was just everywhere power. And then you get it, the advanced, you begin to separate it out and classify it into divisions and so on. It's a discussion of shamanism. But you wind up on page 11, I think, with the idea that the law or the principle of equivalence is the law of the Enlightenment, right? That once you get universal fungibility, then you simply equate everything. Quantity allows for the equation of everything into universal exchangeability, right? Money, the universal equivalent, can emerge in some form. Okay, so then there's passages on language and myth and so on. But it's really, let's just jump to page 25 where we get to an actual discussion of Homer's Odyssey. I'm going to stop it here and then we'll pick that up.